Hello, everybody. My name is Jean Bell. Welcome to this ongoing series NPQ is hosting called Responding to COVID-19. Today, we're going to talk about financial leadership, making good decisions in what are quite literally unprecedented times. And we're really glad to be partnering again with FMA and Hilda Polanco, and also another expert vice president and CFO, Amy West, who you're going to meet in a second. You can see on the screen here that we also have a sponsor for today's webinar, allowing us to bring it to you for free. Unit 4 is next generation enterprise software. It helps your nonprofit do all kinds of things in an automated way, including financial planning, analysis, human resources management, etc. So we hope you will take a look at Unit 4, and we thank them for sponsoring today's webinar and allowing us to bring it to you for free. You also see on the screen our handle and the hashtag for today's conversation, NPQ COVID. So please do join us all throughout today. We encourage you to share comments or questions. You don't only have to pose questions. You are also going through this, as we all are, and we want to hear what's going on in your organizations and what you're learning. Next slide, please. Here are some reminders for you logistically. We always record our webinars so that people who can't be here today can watch them. So not to worry, you will get this recording in a couple of days from NPQ. We're going to use the Q&A box to moderate your comments. And as I said, not just questions, but comments, whatever you'd like to pose to Hilda and Amy throughout the conversation. And today is a conversation. This is not a technical assistance webinar. As we said clearly in our marketing, this is not a PPP webinar, although our participants may have some experience with applying for PPP loans. That's not what this is about. This is a conversation with very senior, seasoned executives about how they're exercising their financial leadership in these unprecedented times. We'll also have an evaluation, as we always do. It only takes a few minutes, so we encourage you to provide direct feedback to us, not only about how today's session went, but what else do you need support on in responding to COVID, and we can continue to curate that for you. And again, you can join us on social media using the hashtag NPQCOVID. Next slide, please. So what I want to do is start the conversation by asking both Hilda and Amy to introduce themselves. And Hilda, why don't we start with you, because you're coming with two hats on at least, as both the CEO of an organization and somebody who has a wonderful perspective on what financial leaders are facing across our sector.
Thank you, Jean. So yes, I'm Hilda Polanco. I'm the founder and CEO of FMA. We're a national consulting firm that has offices in New York, Chicago, DC, Oakland, California, and Providence, Rhode Island.
Wonderful, thank you for being here. And when did you found FMA?
FMA is 20 years old.
20 years old, okay, great, thank you. And Amy, if you would introduce yourself, please.
Of course. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy West, and I'm the Executive Vice President and CFO of AHRC New York City. AHR New York City is a New York City-based nonprofit, and we support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I oversee finance, IT, admin, and real property. We're rather large. Our operating budget is over $300 million, and we employ 5,000 people. We operate programs, residential programs, day services, educational programs throughout the 5 boroughs of New York. Most of our funding, we are a fee-for-service organization. That's really our revenue model, and I would say over 85% of our funding is governmental, predominantly from New York State.
Great, thank you. And thank you both so much for being here. Next slide, please. So what I want to do is offer you an outline of how this conversation is going to go. I should say that I'm not a neutral moderator. About 15 years ago, I wrote a book called Financial Leadership, which I have to say today feels a bit quaint, though some of the principles no doubt carry forward. And we've used that term here very specifically, and I know it's one Hilda uses too, that we're not, although we all are very familiar with accounting and there are accounting issues that come up as we respond to a crisis like COVID, Today, we're really talking about the leadership role, about money and managing the business and keeping people aligned as we make difficult decisions and scenario planning and the kinds of things that people use financial information and other kinds of information to make good decisions around. And that's what I really want to talk with you both about is as we get into the third month of this or so, how are you making those kinds of decisions? And also, both of you, as you just alluded to, have different business models. And across both of your organizations, there's government revenue, there's fee for service, there's foundation revenue. So it's important we know that people's responses to COVID, their business responses, are very dependent on both their program models as well as their revenue models, right? We're all having different experiences based on the matrix of those, how those things relate, what kinds of programming we offer, and what the revenue sources are. So we're going to get into that today and feel those nuances as you both share your experiences. And we're dividing the conversation into these 5 large buckets, so there's lots of opportunity for you to comment and probe. One is just simply to learn what has been the result on these 2 different businesses of COVID-19. Then we're going to get into the myriad of strategies you've used to stabilize. Then we're going to talk about how you've communicated with staff and board and stakeholders as you make these different decisions. We're going to spend some time on scenario planning. What scenarios are you planning for? And how are you doing that scenario planning? Is it different in the context of a crisis? And lastly, we'll talk about what lessons, because in any crisis, we're having to think on our feet, innovate quickly, and no doubt as senior executives, you're experiencing lessons and things that may permanently change even once we get the virus contained. So that's the arc of our conversation. I'm really looking forward to engaging you in it. So next slide, please. And let's start with you, Hilda, as a financial capacity builder and back office support organization, et cetera. What have you seen as a result of COVID at FMA?
For us, I guess I would start by saying that we are an earned revenue organization. Our work is directly with nonprofits, also with funders, both foundations and government, for their grantees as well as themselves. And for us, what happened was a sudden sense of urgency took upon us. And what that meant for us, it was one, continuing to meet our clients where they are, which literally meant video instead of in person, which was all the work that we normally would do. And then secondly, it became clear that financial management was as a cornerstone of leadership during this time. And we needed as a team to balance our reach and the depth of the work that we do with organizations. So we have been responding to that increased sense of urgency and looking to pivot to online learning and some other vehicles that I'll share more about in a little bit.
Wonderful. Let's get a sense from you, Amy. Very different programming you do. What has happened to your business as a result of COVID-19?
Sure. I mean, it was amazing how quickly it seemed to happen. It was almost like overnight, but we were mandated to close our day programs, and that represents about 26% of our revenue. When the public schools closed in New York City, we were also mandated to close our schools, and that's about 13% of our revenue. Our employment services were pretty much decimated as we saw corporations close. Our clinics needed to shut down. The bulk of our administrative staff all of a sudden needed to work remotely. We operate summer camps, and clearly summer camp 2020, running those camps is doubtful. And then our residential programs, while they continue to operate, sadly, we started to have some of the people that we support pass away, as well as a few of our staff members.
Wow, I'm sorry to hear that. And again, you're based in New York City, and we know that's been a really challenging place for the pandemic. So you lost both clients and staff so far in this process.
Yes.
I'm sorry for that. And I know there's some people on this webinar who've experienced similar things or with loved ones. So it sounds like in your case, whereas in Hilda's case, it was an immediate urgency and a shift in some methodologies or modalities. In your case, as a human service organization, there was a lot of initial sort of freezing of programs or canceling of programs. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's absolutely true. And clearly working with our funders, we were able to be made whole in certain cases. In other cases, we needed to be very creative.
Right. And have you had to lay off staff or furlough staff, therefore, Amy?
No, we have not. We have not had a furlough program or layoffs as of yet. When we go through our budget process, and you had mentioned scenarios, we can certainly talk about that, and that's certainly on the table during our 2021 budget process. But we have not needed to lay off or furlough staff as of yet.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's talk a little bit about, on the next slide, strategies for stabilization. And I'm using that term really broadly. Stabilization may mean programmatic shifts, it might mean financial shifts, it might mean the use of reserves or debt, it might mean furloughing, although you haven't done that yet. So Hilda, let's start with you. What are some of the strategies that you've used, defining financial leadership very broadly, to stabilize your organization and optimize what it's doing for its clients?
So on March 9th, we became a shelter-at-home organization. Even though some of the states we do business in had not mandated it, we realized it was what was important to us in terms of the safety of our staff and our clients. And what that meant was that we needed to very quickly be in touch with our staff in a different way. We established what we call our COVID working group. And every day for 30 minutes, we meet and we primarily review agenda items that are around team health as well as firm health. And in that process, we also took a step back and reflected on the fact that we were in the process of completing our strategic plan. And a 3-year plan just didn't seem like a reasonable focus right now. So in order to maximize our outcomes and our value to the sector, we pivoted to a 15-month plan. And in that 15-month plan, we're prioritizing a few areas where we think for stabilizing the firm and the impact that we aim to achieve were a priority. First, we've been working very closely with funders who have reached out to us with a sense of urgency to say, help our grantees, work with them to make better decisions or more informed decisions. We've seen automation. Not every organization was operating on the cloud before COVID, and now there's really been not much of a choice. So we've had a laser focus on bringing organizations to a virtual environment. We also realized that we only have a certain number of hours in the day, and we kept going back to what is our core mission. For us, maximizing the nonprofit's ability to access capital and to access resources is one of our priorities. When the Paycheck Protection Program began, that affected so many nonprofits, we made it our #1 priority for a period of time, and we've really been amazed at how doable it has been through clinics and through other activities to bring to the nonprofit sector access to those loans. And now we're focusing on planning for the loan and forgiving the forgiveness potential, which is the greatest potential. So for us, it's a rapid response, leveraging our skill sets and understanding that clients need our help, but they're only ready for it when they're ready. And that's been a bit of an art to meet them where they are and bring them some perspective and assistance in some of the difficult choices that they're making.
Yeah, I heard at least 4 things. And again, I would be curious to hear from our audience where the parallels are. The first thing I heard is that you're meeting very frequently and that you had at least 2 dimensions to that COVID response. Can you did you say, what were the 2?
It was team health and firm well-being.
Okay, so that's kind of your skeleton for the meeting?
Yes.
I love that. Okay. That's certainly applicable in any context. And then you changed, you sort of halted and reframed your strategic planning process that you happen to be in to acknowledge that a 3-year plan doesn't make much sense in the middle of a pandemic. So you've shifted there. Big focus on automation for your nonprofit clients. The last ones to resist are now unable to resist automation, right? And then it sounds like really focusing on immediate needs. And given the kind of work you do with nonprofits, that was about PPP and rapid response. Amy, what have been some of the strategies you've used at AHRC to stabilize, given that extreme effect that COVID had so fast on your organization?
Sure. I mean, the first thing, and I suppose it's the CFO in me, but I focused on liquidity. And I know it sounds fundamental, but we aggressively billed and collected our receivables. We slowed down our payables a bit with the messaging that we're still paying people, but just at a little bit of a slower rate. We carefully monitor the draw on our line of credit, at least daily, if not twice daily. We started, we formed a discrete account in our general ledger to capture additional COVID expense. And we really started to almost on a daily basis do cash projections. The other thing we did was we went to our primary funders and our provider groups to find out how we can maximize our revenue. Basically, the state education department has made us whole as if we are conducting our school programs. And New York State thus far has made our day programs and reimbursed us as if we're conducting our day programs. But then we also worked with our bankers and our financial consultants to see what other funding opportunities are out there. So the CARES Act is a prime example. We're a rather large organization, so not really able to take advantage of many of the provisions of the CARES Act, but those that we are able to take advantage of that are beneficial for us, we are taking advantage of. A huge push, and you've seen this in the national news, PPE to keep our staff safe. People are going into residential houses that actually have COVID in those houses, and we needed to keep our people safe. We've offered within our residential programs premium pay, again, to reward those that are really helping us out during the pandemic. Something new for us, ensuring that our administrative staff have the tools and the technology to work from home and to telecommute. And then we too created a communication strategy.
Wow, exhale. That's a tremendous amount. And again, you're a large organization, but I'm guessing that a lot of our listeners who work in direct service and proximate kinds of human services are resonating an awful lot with a number of the strategies that you've employed. I want to go into a couple. You talked about, from a financial perspective, creating a separate GL and capturing COVID-specific expenses. The PPE, the equipment that you've had to purchase to protect your staff and perhaps your clients, that clearly goes in there. What other kinds of things are you capturing distinctively?
Well, we had mentioned the premium pay, transportation, cases where our staff hotel expense, cases where staff felt more comfortable staying in a hotel versus going back and staying with their families. Again, transportation, the subway system is a place that's not all that appealing at this point. And so, you know, if we needed to put, give people rental cars or car service in cases, that's going in there. We had talked about premium pay. We also, through our foundation and all this was funded, we created an emergency fund for our staff where, you know, if staff needed additional monies to support their family, we created a fund where they could apply for additional assistance. We also created a special fund for the people that we support, again, and their families if they needed additional assistance.
Thank you. I'm curious about the premium pay. Obviously, that's, I think, not as relevant for FMA, but clearly relevant for Amy's organization. And just to learn a little bit about a decision like that, to get to this issue of decisions in unprecedented times, how did you come to that, briefly, how did you come to that decision? Who was involved? And was it a challenging one to distinguish who gets premium pay, who doesn't? Let's use that as an example of something. How did you quickly decide to do that and roll it out?
Sure. I think what we did first, we started with the criteria, and the executive team, which includes our head of HR, was involved in this. We set the criteria, and basically, when we talked about premium pay, we were really talking about staff that were working in residential homes. We need staff in the residential homes. It's a 24 hour, 7-day operation. And then we tried to strike the right number. You know, we talked about double time. We talked about time and a half. We talked about the possibility of just giving an extra $5 an hour that staff work. So we landed on two different types of premium pay. Basically, our residential staff that were working in any residence received $4 per hour more than they were receiving before the pandemic. And then those houses where there was clearly COVID in the houses, we offered double pay in extreme cases. So it was both a financial decision and a decision where we absolutely needed staff. As a last resort, we created a group of nurses that could go in, but that, unless it's absolutely necessary, is very costly. Yeah. So it's a balance of really protecting the people you support, your staff, and a financial decision. You know, one of the reasons you had asked about the RU, but you can see that kind of expense when people are really just trying to do the right thing and purchasing the PPE and offering premium pay, and really out of the best interest of the organization, you can see the reality of those costs just getting to a point where it's unaffordable.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Hilda, I want to switch gears because there's a number of people asking back to your frequent meetings and the distinction between team health and organizational health. Can you share a little bit about the kinds of things first of all, who's invited to that meeting, and what are you sharing with one another around team health?
So the team is the 4 principals of the firm, the director of talent and director of communications. And around team health, we've been addressing issues like, does everyone have the technology that they need in order to deliver successfully? We realize that we have many challenges. Some of our young parents are homeschooling while they're providing the work for our clients. Are they able to take the time that they need to just for self-care during the day? We wanted them to be comfortable letting us know if they needed to come up with a different work schedule, if full-time just wasn't working for them, if they needed to mark their calendars between a certain time of the day for homeschooling or anything else they needed just to take care of themselves and their family. And those were things we addressed slowly as we learned what the challenges were. We also established virtual water coolers. And during the first few weeks, and still to this day, a little bit less frequently, people get together just to connect. And those were all ideas that came from those morning meetings with regard to how can we support our team. We support virtual yoga that anyone can dial into. We have a virtual workout with one of our team members that loves working out, and they've done that together at retreats and other firm events. And so we were trying to just embrace the team as much as we can, and that team of the talent and communications have been an amazing team working together to communicate with all of us.
Wonderful. Thank you. Those are great ideas for keeping people connected and also just doing sense making in terms of how staff are doing. We talked a lot about that in our last webinar in terms of HR and COVID and the kinds of things we're learning about supporting staff and their distinct experiences, their very distinct experiences of this pandemic. A whole set of equity issues infused there as well. Let's go to the next slide, please. And I want to talk a little bit specifically about communicating hard decisions. And by hard decisions, I mean things like we're going to need people to take some risks around serving clients. This program needs to go on hiatus, right? We are going to tap our line of credit much more than we would normally do at this time of year, et cetera. So Amy, let me start with you because I think you probably have had more of those given the model that you're in. What have been some of the things that have worked and maybe some that have not worked in terms of communicating decisions like that to your staff and board?
Sure. Well, we had, similar to Hilda, we immediately started having daily meetings with created a cross-functional team comprised of the CEO, our executive team, and all the programmatic leads. And we really broke that up into many different categories. One was documentation. There was just so much information about what we should be doing, and oftentimes with conflicting information. So we had a person really looking at all of the documentation and all the rules and the state regulations that were being disseminated to figure out what it is we needed to do. We had a report from our HR director talking about staff. Often we needed to report if folks did have COVID and that kind of thing. We had our head of communications where it was discussed what should be disseminated to all of our staff and what needs to be created. We talked about education, how you educate all of the staff. And again, in this world of a very decentralized organization where people are not really necessary together and it's all through, computers and telecommuting, hard to communicate that information. We talked about supplies and equipment. It was very hard to get PPE. We have an awesome procurement person that was able to really, she did a great job on that. And again, a financial update and program planning. Our communication team got out, disseminated a daily communication to all staff, what you need to know. One of the really difficult things is you start to lose people that you support as well as staff is really not being able to honor them. People felt so isolated. So one of the things that we did when we did lose someone is a tribute. People would write tributes in the honor of the people that we lost. The board was amazing. We have quarterly board meetings in a normal environment. We started meeting with our board on a weekly basis. Mm-hmm. And the CEO has created a town hall, and really it's about 10 minutes of our CEO communicating to staff kind of what's going on, and then 50 minutes of him responding to questions in real time. And that has been incredibly effective.
Wow, I'm sure that your staff have a lot of questions. We're getting a lot of questions about how you're managing staff in this environment and with their physical safety. Maybe we can just spend another minute on that. Amy, have you lost some people who simply just didn't feel they could take those risks? Have you had some resignations or people step down?
We have had a few, but really not many. The one thing about AHRC is people are so committed to the organization and the people we support. Truly heroes, but we have not lost a lot of staff as a result of this. We've had obviously concerns about coming back to work at our administrative office and that kind of thing, and we are very cognizant of their concerns. But again, all of this messaging is really about how do we protect the people we support and the staff.
And this both of you have talked about greatly increasing the frequency of communication, and the town hall with your CEO, Amy, is obviously that's virtual. Do you do a Zoom meeting and everyone can opt in? Is it mandatory?
It's not mandatory, but it is via Zoom, and the turnouts have been incredible. Again, I think people feel isolated and really want to continue to feel connected to our organization. So those have been really very successful.
Great. And let's talk for a second. This is about the stakeholders. We've talked about employees, but You have both talked a minute ago about going back to funders and trying to make sure that you either kept whole or repurposing or shifting programming mid-grant or contract. Can you speak a little bit about how you've been communicating with funders and what has worked? Let me start with you, Hilda, and then I'll come back to Amy. What have you been telling your funders and what messages have been getting through, do you think?
So as I mentioned, when the funders reached out to us, they were coming from a place of concern and urgency. And our first response, first we needed to revisit the programming that we were planning, which was our capacity building leadership development programs, which are all in person and large groups. And so there was a very understanding funder. I would say that has been the case in every instance where they understand that we needed to repurpose the program and redesign. And we've been able to do that and have converted many of the programs to online. There was also this question of this depth and breadth. We want to get really good thinking to the greatest number of grantees. How quickly could we do this? And that led to the webinars that we have been delivering nationally for funders as well as publicly, as well as some more engaged activities through Zoom to be able to deliver. So funders have been very understanding in that context. Mm-hmm. And also, in some cases, they extended the programming time for us to be able to deliver in the future. And again, this question of financial management, decision making being so critical, funders are asking us how do we best support that? Funders want to be supportive but not be a part of and keep their distance and respect the confidentiality of the work. And that's been a big part of what we've been trying to build in support of the funder requests, and also in support of the nonprofits, who some are ready for scenario planning, some are past it and are thinking beyond, and some are still in a bit of paralysis trying to decide where to start. So for us, that's been the depth of the conversations with the funders.
Great, thank you. And Amy, what has been your success in getting funders to fund programs that you can't deliver on fully in terms of units of service? You identified as fee for service. So if I can't provide that service or I can't provide it at that scale, but I don't want to lay off staff, which you haven't for the most part, it sounds like, you need to be kept whole, right? So how is that going?
Well, we've been basically it's an interesting industry in that there are some very strong provider groups and many organizations such as AHRC are in the same position, and so we've rallied together and approached the provider groups, who have then approached the state about funding. I think there's an overall philosophy that the state realizes that the last thing they want organizations to do is just a knee-jerk reaction, which has happened in crisis in the past, where you just lay off staff or you furlough staff. Mm-hmm. And so thus far, they have been very supportive of kind of paying us, even though we're not providing the same level of services as we have in the past, but provided that we retain our employees. So again, with a little bit of creativity, and thus far, I think the state has been very supportive in trying to keep us whole.
Right. We know, unfortunately, we know this in New York, I think, already, in terms of future budgets. And what's going to happen with states in the next fiscal years when they really see the result in terms of taxation of this, what's seeming like a depression, at least for now. So I know this is going to be a long-term question in terms of how long states are going to be able to function that way if we can't, if they don't have the revenues, no?
I think that, again, I think in New York State, they've been doing the right thing, and they have put health in front of finances, but obviously it's the realization that the revenue is not there. The state is currently working on their budget, as is New York City, and I think it's going to be a very difficult couple of years. Absolutely.
Yeah, and MPQ's been covering that a lot. So we're going to get in a second to scenario planning, and we have to keep that in mind. It's not only when does the pandemic end and when can we come back to work, but what is the state of our economy and how is that going to affect both our public and private funders? Before we leave this topic, though, a number of questions about the board. Amy, you talked about your board going from quarterly to, I think, weekly, did you say?
Yes.
Okay, can you just share with us what is the agenda? And frankly, have you found that useful given that you've got the weekly CEO town hall and all of this other communication going?
I think it has been incredibly helpful. Certainly initially weekly made a lot of sense. I think we're at a point now where perhaps they're considering maybe every other week, because it seems like now we're just really kind of reporting on the same things. But basically, there's the CEO kicks those meetings off, and there's a program report, there's a financial report, there's a report about our staff, there's a report about our efforts with dealing with the state. Absolutely, a weekly report on what the state's thinking is on the budget, the New York State budget. Legal counsel, our general counsel, presents on any issues that we may be encountering. So it's pretty, again, the entire executive team is there kind of just presenting and identifying any issues in our various functional areas. And again, it's been kind of a good for the executive team, because I think the board really has embraced how hard we're trying, and I think has more confidence in the executive team than they've ever had before. But as I say, it certainly made a lot of sense to have the weekly meetings. I think we're now at a point where probably every other week makes sense. I would say that about our daily cross-functional team meetings too. It probably makes sense every other day at this point versus on a daily basis.
Okay, that's really helpful. And it's true, one of the, I guess, silver linings is that boards get visibility into the expertise and teamwork and decision-making capacity of senior leadership in situations like this. Let's go to the next slide, and we're going to talk a little bit about scenario planning. And before we get into financial scenarios, can we talk for a second about how you're thinking about returning to work? Are there practices or policies that you're playing with? Because that may be as hard a decision as when it was time to say you can't be at work, or you can only be at work with PPE or with hazard pay, et cetera. So how are you both thinking about return to work? Hilda, let me start with you.
So for us, because we had been preparing for a virtual environment, some of us partly virtual before COVID, for us today, it's maintaining the safety of our staff and trying our hardest to deliver our services virtually for the foreseeable future. So we are hoping that our staff does not need to return. We know they don't need to return to our offices. Most of our work is done with clients or virtually. And with clients, for the foreseeable future, we are continuing to describe our service model as an online model. I think what that does, though, is it takes us from we're going to do the best we can working from home to we may be working from home for longer than we thought. What does that mean? And that's the stage, that was this morning's working group conversation. How will we be able to support what the needs are? And we don't know what they are. Our next step is to understand from our team what would they need for a longer term virtual work environment. Our offices are there across the country. We're not so sure that there's a reason to go in right away, even if those states are opening up.
Right. And of course, with a national organization, you're going to have different states and different situations. And so you're going to have employees with different mandates that they're responding to. Amy, let's move a little bit into not only how you're thinking about back to work, but also your approach at this point to scenario planning. I know you have a July budget coming up you referenced, so you can answer both questions.
Okay, sure. With respect to scenario planning, and I basically have spent most of my professional career in the not-for-profit sector, And my organizations in the past have been significantly impacted by 9/11, by Hurricane Sandy. And I think what's a little bit different about, there are a lot of similarities, but what's really different about the COVID pandemic, after 9/11 and after Hurricane Sandy, we just probably, just basically said, okay, what now? And here with COVID-19, because it's ongoing, it's really not only what now, but what are we going to do? And you had referenced our budget process for this year, and clearly it's very different than it has been in the past. But we're really doing three scenarios. One is what we're calling baseline. So that is, okay, what would our budget look like if we're up and running July 1st, the start of our fiscal year? And we're doing that primarily because our budget process, while there are a few elements of zero-based budgeting, it's primarily incremental budgeting. And so we have a baseline from prior years. So that's where we started. And then realizing that we will not be completely up and running by July 1, we're creating what we call our most likely scenario. And that is most likely the one that will be adopted by the board. And then we're creating a third scenario, and that we're calling a severe scenario. And that is, what happens if we need to close the program for the entire fiscal year, or what happens if we need to close the program for half a year, or we really do need to have a significant reduction in force, or we had talked about this state financing and that there probably will be issues with the New York State budget. So what happens if the state cuts our rates by 5%, 10%? And that's really kind of what we're calling the a severe scenario. So we are positioned in all three cases. Again, we're most likely going to adopt the likely as we know it, with the understanding that we may need to amend it throughout the year as we get more information. With respect to bringing people back, we've started creating a plan to bring people back at our administrative offices in Lower Manhattan, and we're definitely going to be using a phased-in approach. One of the biggest issues we have in New York is really the subway system, and if indeed social distancing, and that seems to be the case, helps to prevent the spread of COVID and keeps people safe, it is very hard to social distance on the New York City subway. So we really need to take that into consideration. So it will be a phased-in approach. Who needs to come back? We have had people in our administrative offices, myself included, throughout this. And, one of the lessons learned, not jumping ahead, but, technology, we should be able to run a payroll 100% remotely. And how do we do that? So very much a phased-in approach, very much emphasis on keeping our staff safe and certainly making them feel safe.
Amy, I'm curious if you don't mind sharing. Did you tap reserves to finish out June 30th? How are you thinking about surplus and deficit bridging from this year, where your Q4 ended with the pandemic and you're carrying forward in the pandemic into Q1?
We did have to tap into our reserves a little bit. Most of it was actually the additional COVID-19 expense, the PPE, et cetera. Which we are hoping still that we can get some funding from. We did receive some funding from the AHRC New York City Foundation to cover some of those costs, but that's really what's driving the deficit. Where we were originally projecting a modest surplus, and now we're really projecting a modest deficit. So we've had to tap into our reserves a bit, but so far we've been really successful at managing our liquidity. So we're doing okay. Okay,
thank you. And just to reiterate, since you had specific language for it, you're doing a full 3 scenarios for a massive budget. One is baseline, one is most likely, and one is severe. And the severe not only takes into account perhaps extended COVID-related things, but a pretty drastic state budget scenario, since that's a key element of your funding. So I just wanted to lift that up again to remind us that it's not just COVID, it's all the economic ramifications of COVID that are going to affect our respective funding sources and therefore our scenarios, right? Even if we are able to bring people, quote, back to work.
That's absolute. That's a great point. Absolutely.
Great. So let's go to our next question, and we've started to hint at it, and that's around lessons learned. And Hilda, are there things that you've learned personally in terms of your own financial leadership and or ways that you see FMA as a financial capacity builder to others, maybe permanently different because of COVID?
So I think on a couple of levels. The first is when we were faced with redesigning our work, for the most part, much of our direct work with nonprofits was virtual in many ways. So that was easier, but the in-person capacity building, we needed to be able to experiment, to innovate, to take risks. And it's been really wonderful to see team members within FMA join forces and try something new, something we hadn't done before. And I think that that spirit of innovation is going to stay with us going forward and not being afraid to try something new. In addition, we've realized for ourselves and for our clients that the real-time data for decision making is critical. And so in cases where you don't have that data, you're making decisions with a hunch, which only takes you so far. And so the quality of that data is coming with us into the future. We have refined our budgeting processes, we have refined our scenario planning processes, and that's a muscle that we will continue to carry with us. The automation, supporting our nonprofits with the bringing them on the cloud, I think that spirit remains. And as we start to think of next year, we see interest in going even one step further than they were just from the basics going to the cloud. So I think that's going to change our delivery model. Our learning modalities are going to change. We are already experimenting with breakout rooms and word clouds, and I'm really excited about the way in which I've seen learning evolve at FMA. In addition, we know that online learning, we have a lot to learn from higher education and other places. So for us moving forward, we are going to take that as a priority. How do we maximize the learning? We've also, we also see this as an opportunity to maybe hire more nationally now that we are working more this way. Folks who maybe would not have thought to join a New York City firm or a firm in any of our offices might be more willing to join us. But I would say in closing, in terms of the things that we have really grown in and we want to take with us, it's this idea that financial management is really the glue between the programmatic activity, the fundraising, and just organizational health. And if this crisis allows us to prioritize financial planning as part of long-term strategy, then we'll take that. We'll take that for ourselves as a growing organization, and we would love to see it for our clients. The willingness to, Amy, you talked about the board meetings shifting and your budget being due now. One of the things that we've encouraging clients and organizations that we work with is to go back to their boards and say, we can't give you this perfectly laid out budget, but here's 3 things or 2 that we're thinking about. We'd like you to approve this, but we know that these are the drivers that are going to change reality. And we're going to come back and talk to you on such and such a date. So these questions of what you do know and what you don't know, and then when will you know what you don't know? And when you know, what actions will you take? And that's what I'm hoping we'll all take from this and be more willing to be flexible as we plan.
And it's interesting because there's such a tension just on that board issue between meeting frequency and meeting quality and recruitment and retention and all these things. But the reality is data is moving a lot faster than quarterly. And so while we all might love quarterly meetings, and I know that's, from a sort of board member recruitment and retention perspective, it sounds nice. It's only 4 meetings a year. That's not the pace of change right now. And Amy, I'm glad this slide is still up because there are a lot of questions about your scenarios. So I want to stay here for a second because you gave us such rich detail about your 3 scenarios. What guidance do you have for people as they're crafting those? How do you guide people to provide input for the severe scenario versus the most likely? What are the levers? How do you provide guidance to your people providing you data?
I think you start, again, the way that we've approached this is just laid out the assumptions and just really just put it all out on paper and then kind of really just start taking off that piece of paper what you really don't think is your severe scenario. I think you also need to take care that information is very confidential. And you really don't want your severe scenarios to end up on a copy machine somewhere. And so our severe scenarios are really being formulated by our executive team, but really kind of thinking about, really out of the box and just really pushing, being as provocative as we possibly can with these things. And then again, taking and detracting back. So it starts really with the assumptions first and then putting the numbers around the assumptions.
Okay. And thank you for that practical guidance about when you're creating a severe scenario. Obviously, you're talking about significant reductions in force and other kinds of expenses that there's a tension there with transparency and creativity and wanting to engage people. But it sounds like that severe scenario is pretty much crafted by senior executive level staff.
I think it needs to be initially, obviously, the communication piece when it's, if indeed any of those elements of the severe scenario come to fruition, then communication becomes incredibly important. But while you're formulating the severe scenario, I think it's best to keep it to a small group of people.
Can we go to the next slide, please? And Amy, if you can transition and build on Hilda's comments about what you're learning. What lessons are you going to take with you when, God willing, we contain this virus, or we have we have a vaccine, or we have some comfort that we're going to know how to live with COVID? What's going to stay with you as a financial leader?
Sure. I mean, I think it really, and Hilda had talked about this as well, but it really reaffirmed the importance of financial health for me. And cash really is king, and the importance of operating reserves. And although that we didn't really need to significantly dip into our operating reserves during a crisis, the last thing you really want to be is being concerned about paying your critical vendors and meeting your payroll. So really, financial health is very important during a financial crisis. It also, the need to rely on our third-party partners was something that was reaffirmed during this crisis. Really the need to rely on your financial consultants for wisdom, your bankers for wisdom. One of the things that we're really thinking about is this whole bricks and mortar. I mean, we are an organization, we operate 150 sites throughout the 5 boroughs of New York, and we have a large administrative building in Lower Manhattan. Do we really need all of that space? And can we identify employees that really can telecommute and effectively telecommute? We talked so much about the importance of communication, but communication, you realize how important that is throughout all levels. And one of the things that we were working on before the pandemic, but really the value of telehealth has been a huge, definitely in some sense, a very positive. We see how effective it can be and how it works.
Make sure that people know what you're referring to. Telehealth. How do you define that?
That's really, instead of sending people, we have people that we support where we would normally see them in doctor's offices or in emergency rooms, but really being able to access a doctor using technology, where the people that we support and our staff, for that matter, don't need to go and make an ER visit or an urgent care visit or a doctor's visit. So that's something without question that we have learn the value of, and we will continue to embellish on that lesson learned. I think there will be things as we go through our scenario analysis, back to basics, back to our core programs. Maybe there are things that we're doing that we really shouldn't be doing. Large organization, again, decentralized organization, but maybe a little bit of sensible contraction needs to take place. And then I know personally I've been really challenged with managing a staff. I manage over 100 people, and I am very challenged. Something that I need to learn how to do is managing people remotely. I'm kind of used to picking up the phone and saying, do you have a minute? And so this whole experience has been very different for me and how to manage staff.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for raising all of those issues. And some of those were affirming practices that we talk about in theory, and now here we are in a rainy day fund. And so to have had a reserve, right, to already have strong relationships with third parties, to prioritize communication with staff. But all of those things predated this, but now have been affirmed, is what I hear you saying. And Hilda, you've been working remotely with a lot of your staff for a long time. And we had a lot of people write in and say they appreciated your water cooler example. In just under a minute, can you share what's a virtual water cooler, and how has it worked for you?
So the virtual water cooler initially was everyone come and just say hi. And it was by geography, so it was meant to replace the water cooler in your local office. Then they became more firm-wide. People wanted to see each other. And as the days have gone by, the water coolers are now two types. One type is just come and say hello. We can talk about anything you'd like. And another water cooler is let's just come and talk about what's happening. Mm-hmm. If you want to share something personal, something with your family, or you just want to talk about what you heard on the news last night. It felt like those two conversations were hard to have in one group. So it's really meant to help people connect almost on their terms, on what they're ready to connect about. And we may have some other incarnation of the water cooler in the future, but that's where it is today. And I will say that being virtual when you want to, on Fridays, many of us would work from home, or whenever our family activities would be conducive to us working from home, and we wanted to have that flexibility. It's different when you don't have a choice now. And some of our team members I know would rather not be in their apartment right now. They'd rather be somewhere else. So it's a different kind of virtual, and I'm hoping that as the months progress, there'll be some balance between the two.
I love it. Thank you. Thanks for sharing the virtual water cooler strategy. Next slide, please. So we are wrapped up for today, and really appreciative of you sharing your stories. And Amy, again, as many people have written in and said, thank you for the work that you're doing, and we acknowledge the challenges and the losses that your staff and your client base have experienced. Thank you both for being here. Please do check out the FMA toolkit on COVID. Go to their website. You'll find a whole bunch of resources about PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, and other kinds of responses. And in fact, we're going to partner with them again on May 14th on a webinar that's focused on if you got a PPP loan, good for you, or if you've got one coming, how do you manage it, and how do you make sure you can get it forgiven? So we're going to talk about that with Hilda's colleague, Gina McDonald, on May 14th. So check your inboxes for that. And we'll leave it there for today and ask you to complete your evaluation as always. Hilda, thank you. Amy, thank you very much for the work that you do and for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.